As you probably know, he worked as a scriptwriter and journalist before becoming an architect, but has retained the sensibilities of a writer, someone who's been involved with filmmaking, of finding the energy and the nature of the contemporary. I should say that my role was going to be filled by Charles Jenks, and the initial discussions about this particular session were held between Rem and Charles. And Charles, sadly, is not entirely fit, and felt that he wasn't able to come. And I will do my best to substitute him, but I do acknowledge that I'm a substitute. Tonight, we're going to have a dialogue. And this is another medium that I think Rem has used, and he uses it both to tease out and to discuss, and to some extent to define ideas, or at least make them something that can be used. Now, he's done that in many places, notably at the Serpentine, also Garage in Moscow, as part of his curation of the 2014 Venice Architecture Biennale. So perhaps we could start just by thinking about what dialogue is and what it offers to architects and architecture.
Basically, maybe dialogue is not exactly the right word. I am a very curious person, and for that reason, there are many people whose knowledge I want to benefit from, and therefore I have a constant inclination to ask people questions. And the traditional way of doing that is doing interviews. And so from the very first moment that I was professionally active, I was an interviewer, and in many ways I'm still an interviewer. And as you mentioned with Hans-Ulrich Obrist, we escalated the whole model of an interview maybe to the point of an absurdity, where we are kind of working for 24 hours asking, I think, 60 inhabitants of London to talk about London. But doing an interview is not only professionally, it's also, asking kind of people in the office for what they know, it's asking clients for what they want. It's really a permanent model of interaction that comes totally naturally.
I'm reminded from what you say of the Russian theorist Mikhail Bakhtin, who tried to describe the dialogic imagination, but what for him was important about speech as opposed to writing was that it was permanently inventing something new.
Well, I think our profession is kind of very dualistic. Because on the one hand, there are certainly moments where you need to be an individual and to be on your own and to be private and to try to have ideas on your own. But in order to have any ideas, for me, it is kind of really necessary to be kind of surrounded or be part of a larger whole. I find it actually quite difficult to define or to even capture, at what moments you have an idea. And ideas for me are more kind of things that emerge after interaction and sessions, and at some point you realize, but mostly in retrospect, that the whole conversation or the whole orchestration in the end led to an insight.
Yeah, so it's a combination of different sorts of interaction and for different purposes. I wonder though that when we deal with the new and the novel, whether when something is new, when it emerges, perhaps not quite perhaps for the first time, but it's less part of the conventions of existing conventions. It prizes them open. It shows something that allows you to go beyond them.
But what do you mean with something new? Because I'm also deeply aware that in many kind of ways, to the extent that there are new things discovered, that they are partly discovered because we cast a new and analytical and critical look at supposedly existing kind of features or supposedly immutable or definitive opinions or supposedly definitive interpretations. And I think that new is not necessarily something that kind of emerges out of nothing, but for me it's typically, by scraping off received opinion of elements.
Yeah. So is this something to do with the process of flow and flux, which you said?
Of what?
Flow and flux.
Flow and flux.
Or the instability of.
I don't really. I don't know exactly how to respond to flow and flux. Kind of flow and flux is kind of probably what happens anywhere, anytime, always. For me, it's kind of really the particular effort it takes to take off the film of what is supposed to be the truth, of almost to take it away, or almost as a kind of form of iconoclasm.
Yes. Well, we may come on to iconoclasm because I think it's an antidote to the idea of the overused and wrongly used word of icon. And an icon, for me, in its original form, is something that has some spiritual or some reflexive qualities. That is something that has been lost in the use of the word as applied to architecture. So I wondered really if iconoclasm, a process of destruction, might be a way of going beyond these rigid conventions.
So the more you question, you follow this line of question, the more I will be at some point kind of forced not so much to contradict you, but to kind of suggest a more perhaps compromising way of looking at things. It's never only one thing. I mean, and particularly if you talk today about destruction and iconoclasm, it's very clear that there is a lot of destruction going on in the world, which has nothing to do with iconoclasm, but which is really deeply damaging and damaging all kinds of positive kind of relationships and structures and constructions. That I would feel very reluctant to, at this point, align myself with destructiveness, and I've been kind of for a long time also very surprised that the word disruptive and disruption had such a magical appeal, because I find it in the current context actually kind of rather off-putting word. And I'm not, and in this kind of phase of it's a political environment, I would be very careful in using this branding about these words.
Okay, I understand. Well, let's think about the book, and I'm thinking about the book in general, that architecture obviously has a long relationship with books. Like go back to Vitruvius, but possibly earlier, and then the nature of the book and the book about architecture transforms when you get printing and you get the Renaissance treaties, which allow ideas to be transmitted further and quicker. And of course, you've got 19th century architectural treatises. You've got the use of book that Le Corbusier made, and I wonder if you can say something. I would like to invite you to say something about the relationship between architecture and the book in the way you have made books about architecture.
I think I'd rather talk about the book today, because I don't necessarily think that there is. It's particularly interesting to talk about the relation between my books and the architect. It's more that I think that when I first came to architecture, or you thought that I might be interested in being an architect, I actually had just written a script that was kind of really considering that the digital might replace vast sections of what was considered reality, that it would replace books, would replace, for instance, real actors, that the digital would power an army of kind of robotic activity that would eventually replace perhaps mankind. It was a kind of a real science fiction. That was in the early 70s. And in a curious way, I feel that, therefore, I've been kind of dealing with digital for 48 years. And that is, for me, an interesting paradox, because what it means that anyone could deal with the digital for such a long time is that the actual implication of the digital, the actual replacement by the digital of vast sections of reality are actually not taking place as fast or as thoroughly as people may still assume. And for me, the book is a key element in that whole debate. Our first considerations about libraries were kind of really fraught from the very beginning, whether libraries are still make sense, whether books still make sense, that the appetite of people to read books is constantly declining, etc., etc. And the reality there seems to be also pointing totally in the opposite direction, that kind of more and more libraries are becoming desired and wanted, and maybe even, to use a rarely used word, needed, and that therefore the whole notion that the book might possibly disappear turns out to be simply an untruth. But I think that books through the digital and through internet are in themselves changing a lot, and that the wonderful thing about this digital kind of pressure has made books much more flexible, but much more, has introduced many more original way to navigate books and to compose books, or even to think about books. So I think that what for me has been exciting is that books can be, ancient as they are. And this week I was, by coincidence, in the Vatican Library and saw the first actually square book dating from the year 500, are actually a very fresh medium that is infinitely flexible and still highly relevant, and therefore very exciting for me to invest in.
Yes, because that's seeing something for the first time. It's seeing a way of representing knowledge, which I think is one of the things I find exciting about books, which I don't if I get information digitally. It doesn't have, you don't have the same relationship with it.
But the point is that a book is a limited quantity of knowledge presented in a particular form of mutual dependencies, and it's orchestrated and edited, and of course in that sense it's the opposite of the infinity of the internet.
So what the book does in the digital age is to help to define little sections of knowledge that and put them in a edited and in a compact way, so that rather it's not just that the book has a certain size that you might be able to carry around, it's actually that what's in it, the information it carries, is something that you can comprehend, rather than having to deal with the whole infinite universe of digital information.
Yeah, well, it is a variable and tangible and accessible chunk, brick of knowledge that even if you're not reading it, you have somehow, if you've read it, an idea of what it kind of represents. And I think that also is a very important difference with books, that once read, they still can retain a very strong virtual presence that can deeply influence your work, your life.
Yes, and one sees them as visual as well as things, something to read. When you put a collection of books together, and it might be just a private bookshelf, or it might be something like a library, then you start to find, and obviously because of the collection, the more important this becomes, that you need to have a sort of taxonomy of books. You have indexing systems, obviously. But what happens in a library is that becomes spatialized. And so one is organising the knowledge contained in books in a spatial manner.
Yeah, I agree, but I don't have any kind of particular thing to say about that aspect. I think, yes, it's true. You make it accessible, and you try to create a kind of montage so that the proximities can be exciting and in a way convey a strong sense of anticipation and anticipation. Yeah.
Well, R.B. Warburg, the German art historian whose library came to London after his death, had the most eccentric cataloguing system that allows one to make all sorts of connections that a more conventional system wouldn't.
Yeah, that's a wonderful. That is one of the wonderful kind of things I think of today. That even the word eccentric is perhaps no longer kind of particularly valid, in the sense that eccentric really worked in the time that there was the obvious way of doing and then the eccentric way of doing. I think, and maybe internet has been kind of one of the triggers of that vast expansion of different systems and vast tolerance of different classification systems that lead to kind of very interesting and moment of precarious expectations, whether, and a precarious question, this classification, is it even still possible? Or is it all kind of fictional and mythical process to kind of pretend order that is not really tenable anymore?
And forms of classification have obviously existed, but they took on a particular force in the early modern period in Europe. I'm thinking of people like Linnaeus and later taxonomies of animals and animal forms. And it then applied not just to people and areas of the world, but to information and knowledge as well.
Sorry.
Yeah. So, and thinking about how taxonomic systems, which have always been around, but I think they took on a particular force in the early modern period, starting with people like Linnaeus and classification of botanical phenomena.
Sorry. No. I think that the point I was trying to make is that the depth of knowledge and the kind of unbelievably fast kind of development of that depth and the sometimes unexpected but sometimes amazing, very often amazing speed with which more knowledge is constantly generated shows to some extent also the end of those kind of simplistic classification systems and generates not really a confusion, but a totally new landscape of knowledge where in a way we have to learn how to navigate and how to interpret almost from scratch.
In terms of navigation, we might to discuss a little bit about politics and the possibilities that lie in politics, because I think you said in one interview that becoming a politician might be an acceptable alternative to being an architect. Or
so basically I'm happy to talk about politics in the sense that the word politician is almost now a negative word. We are all completely convinced that there is very little integrity maybe even very little seriousness to discover in many of our politicians. And the same is true of the word bureaucrat. And I think that our almost massive contempt for these two categories, and almost self-evident contempt for these two categories, are actually creating a very dangerous situation, because I think that only politicians can kind of really describe and generate the framework in which our world unfolds. And I think that bureaucrats, as the technicians of those kind of political visions, are also really crucial in terms of guiding and orchestrating those intentions. And if I see, for instance, what is happening in President, which in itself is a kind of fantastic phenomenon, who in a kind of brilliant campaign created a total breakthrough in a landscape of very old and paralyzed oppositions between classical political parties. And you see that kind of within 1 year of that, kind of even intellectuals are talking already about Macron as a loser, or somebody who deserves the typical contempt for architects, who is unable to deal with kind of people with yellow, yellow whatever. Then you see that there's a kind of very vicious cycle where we hate the people we're dependent on, and we are also never supporting the people that we are dependent on, and where we should develop a kind of real interaction. And I could go on, but maybe
to some extent the media, how this is reported, how the activities and doings of politicians, and to some extent bureaucrats, how their policies are seen out, is understood by most people by how it's reported or represented in the media. You know, who in some cases are very keen to cut down or to contradict.
But I don't think it's necessarily the fault of the media. I think it's our own fault. I think the media is maybe reflecting our own kind of mentality or our own current moment, and maybe to some extent you could blame them that they're not more adventurous. But and let me call the anecdote that I wanted to mention. As part of this interview interest or fetish with Hans Ulrich, I interviewed maybe 6 years ago the remaining survivors of the metabolist movement. Japanese, they were all in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, and what we discovered is a kind of incredibly diverse group from different political convictions. But what we also discovered that the most important, almost puppet master of an entire architectural movement had been a single architect who had become a bureaucrat, and as a bureaucrat was able to commission systematically to the architects of metabolism. When we counted it, over 400 individual studies. And that was not simply a kind of favoritism about privileging a particular movement, but it was ultimately a serious investigation. What are the problems of Japan? How can those problems be dealt with? And what kind of solutions or what kind of imagination needs to be mobilized to actually deal with the problems of Japan. And when we discovered that, I kind of realized that this bureaucrat who in the 80s drove to Tokyo in a red Ferrari, how sad it is that we are unable, I would say collectively, to say what are the problems of a specific country anymore, that we don't have the imagination anymore to subdivide the problematic of a country in different and digestible and perhaps solvable kind of sections, and that there is absolutely no kind of central perspective anymore that would then kind of mobilize the intelligence to deal, and I hate the word solve problems, but to mobilize the imagination to create new solutions.
And that must have been partly spontaneous. I mean, they were trying to. The effects were spontaneous, but even if the intention was to investigate in a serious way the problems that Japan was facing in the 50s and 60s, but then somehow the nature of the interaction became more spontaneous, or perhaps opportunistic is a better word, that they saw something that they hadn't anticipated and then had to find a way around that issue. So the original intentions become not necessarily lost, but they become supplemented or changed or altered.
Well, I beg to differ, because in Japan the interesting thing was that they were actually not diluted. And I think that you were talking as a kind of typical cynical early 21st century person. We simply, and I include myself in that category, but the painful thing is that we cannot imagine it anymore. And that therefore we immediately talk about spontaneity, delusion, diluted kind of ideas, and opportunism. That kind of mix of seriousness, imagination, and ability to act and to mobilize the forces that could deal with kind of serious problems, we simply lost that faith.
Yeah. I think I understand the point. But if we move to Singapore, which you wrote about very interestingly in the SMLX, so you call Singapore the perfect ecology of the contemporary. Could you say a bit more about what you mean by that?
What I meant by that is really very simple. In Singapore, a political regime which came in power in the early kind of late 60s, decided to completely remake Singapore, and they did that, and maybe it is also kind of similar story to the one of us just telling about Japan, and maybe it's interesting that I'm telling stories about Asia in the 60s and 70s, when Asia was for the first time offering the idea of a kind of avant-garde in architecture that was not European and not white, and therefore perhaps an early harbinger of a situation that we are experiencing on a much bigger scale now. But anyway, with the help of the United Nations, with the help of UNESCO, with the help of experts from kind of many different countries, they embarked on a then politically seemingly correct effort to change the whole of Singapore, because Singapore was a mess. It was enormous amount of slums, there was barely any infrastructure, and they really in 30 years radically transformed the entire island to the point that nothing old, or almost nothing old, existed there. And the reason for me to look at Singapore, and I think I wrote it in '94, was the feeling that I had at the time that democracy was not particularly able anymore to organize change, and that there were a number of more authoritarian regimes that were doing it more effectively. And I was extremely alarmed by that kind of situation, because I believe, of course, deeply in democracy. And even then, 24 years ago, I was alarmed that in a competition with democracy, authoritarian regimes might look more efficient. And if you now hear to American businessmen, to Silicon Valley even, that conviction that democracy may be a form of inconvenience and that other kind of regimes are more pertinent, seems to be widespread. And I feel that a kind of society like ours is unbelievably passive in indulging that kind of reading, and is very little mobilized to begin to contradict that and to develop a kind of rhetoric that emanates more confidence and that also recognizes this almost fading of democracy and what it might mean kind of for the world.
It's interesting, of course, democracy, the word has been around for a long time, and what was considered to be democracy in ancient Greece was a long way from what we would consider democracy now. And I wonder if we've reached a crisis in, as it were, Western democracies, particularly the US. The UK obviously has its own problems, which I'd rather not go into. But as you say, these ultra-rich people in Silicon Valley and elsewhere are able to subvert the political process, the democratic process, not necessarily to affect the outcome of each and every time. And I wonder if that's because the American Constitution, which was written in a hurry, done with great seriousness and great purpose and great intelligence, but it did make some mistakes. The first mistake was that all those words about liberty didn't mean anything to 1/5 of the population. But the other thing, which I think is insidious but very interesting, is Jefferson's initiation of the survey of the whole land mass, measuring it out so it could be subdivided into pieces of property. And that idea of democracy, that you had to be a property owner in many places until fairly recently to be considered able to vote. And I wonder if we've come now to a crisis where that has become so great that the ownership of property has overwhelmed the choice that democracy is meant to offer.
For me, it's very difficult to kind of blame anything on the mistakes of others or of a kind of misreading and also to blame it on a kind of single phenomena. I think that it's simply deeply depressing or sad that there is not more energy kind of emanating kind of from the milieu, but also from the classes and from the countries which are in such a fantastically privileged position as we are, and that there is such an incredible conversation about nonsensical issues like identity, such a mobilization about immigration and refugees, and that it in many ways seems as if the last energy that we are ready to spend is to kind of retain our own privileges. So that is more how I see it. I'm really talking about us.
Us being
us now at this moment,
yeah.
And why are we not more mobilized in this case, in this cause, in this case?
Well, apparently, and I don't know how provable this is, but certain psychologists say that when people are offered the choice of the status quo or change, about 55% generally vote for the status quo, or would choose the status quo, which means it's very difficult to change these underlying forces that are pushing in a particular direction.
But I don't believe it, because we are changing constantly. For instance, in 3 years, this country, from a totally open country that was happy to pride itself on the way in which it was able to absorb very great numbers of people coming from different cultures, has turned into an absolutely hostile environment for that. So you cannot say that they're on the side. Thank you. You cannot really say that they're on the side of the status quo. The status quo is kind of radically changing all the time.
So it's constantly.
And I think we look at it and I think we can identify where it is going, but we have very little incentive or imagination, I think, to intervene in it.
Yeah. And I mean, just coming back to Singapore, this remaking of it is a massive Promethean effort, that required not just the erasing to make a tabula rasa of much of the island, but also changing the shape of the island. I mean, it's an extraordinary effort of will with all that goes behind that. But, yeah, well, I suppose the question would be the comments that, your view of Singapore at that time as something had gone wrong in the balance between the politicians and the bureaucrats was perhaps different to what was happening in Japan at a similar time, where there was a more subtle and varied way of developing these ideas.
Basically, I have a kind of real difficulty in declaring kind of right or wrong. I basically, looking at Singapore, I found many things that are really impressive. You call it Promethean. You call it an immense effort of the will, and that is clearly true. And I think that what was finally created in 30 years was actually perhaps a good beginning to now begin to kind of refine or adapt, or to a good background to introduce some other dimensioning. So I don't think they were entirely wrong. I think that you can even kind of discover perhaps a new aesthetics in there. And I think that in many ways, for the population at large, I think they were also quite impressive in terms of achievement. And I think that, for instance, there is a kind of similar situation going on in China, a kind of very authoritarian kind of regime that is doing wonderful things in many ways for its citizens, and has done wonderful. And what preoccupies me is that the only thing that we can do is kind of judge and judge those developments as kind of entirely as negative. We can blame, we can say it's wrong, but we are unable to initiate a dialogue that is more subtle, and that kind of says you're doing some things right and some things wrong, and we are doing some things right, or many things right, but also many things wrong in the current situation, and seeing what kind of dialogue can emerge. And if you look at what Europe and what America, kind of how they judge the world, we are now in a kind of negative, totally negative about Russia, negative about China, negative about the Arabic world. And I think we are unable to be both critical and and have sympathy. And I think that would eventually be a combination that we need to proceed from this impasse.
Well, that's a very interesting point, because we've had numerous entries for the WAF Awards programme from China and also from the Middle East, and it's quite clear that some of the architecture emerging there is very challenging, very interesting, and dealing with quite fundamental issues in a way that, if I read what you're saying or understand what you're saying correctly, we in this part of the world tend to be a little bit complacent about.
No, it's not that we tend to be complacent. We have kind of basically, we are not active enough in kind of undoing the sense of innate superiority that we have, seeing as our birthright. And I think that is something we need to do without necessarily kind of feeling totally guilty or initiating a kind of self-flagellation to undo our form of superiority. I think we should simply abandon it and be more open for a dialogue.
Yeah. Well, that I think comes to a point that you sort of I think you have made in several ways in our discussion, which is about how you understand the contemporary world. I mean, the contemporary world is what it is. You can change it in small ways. Sometimes you're fortunate enough, if you work with other people, you can change it in a major way. But it is what it is, and it all amounts to a sum of possibilities for what we can do with the future.
Well, I think that you started with the word dialogue, and I think that this is what is clearly crucial, and where I think that there is too much kind of moralism kind of still going on that sabotages that.
Yeah, and is this dialogue something that architecture as a practice, as a series of opportunities, of working strategies, can initiate in a way that, you know, you might have a conversation with someone, you might do 24 hours at the Serpentine with Hans Ulrich Obrist, but does the permanent, the long-term existence that architecture has, I won't say permanent, allow certain traces of that dialogue to be present when people experience the building?
Well, I'm happy that you asked a question where I can say unreservedly yes, because in the end, although I started kind of very skeptical of the kind of potential of architecture to be either that readable or that kind of powerful in terms of emanating values, I would say that at this point I experienced it almost bodily. For instance, if we take the case of CCTV, of being kind of criticized unbelievably Chinese, then I had a kind of very disconcerting experience that the building at some point was assumed to be unpopular with the current Chinese leadership. So it seemed to be kind of marooned between Western and Eastern values. But at the same time, I think that if you look at the effect of the kind of building and what it actually triggered in China, one of the interesting things is that Central China Television has been split into parts now, and Central Television and one thing that has a totally different name. That it de facto, I think there is simply an effect that goes and is independent of both Western opinion and I would say the official opinion of the state.
Yeah, the building still exists, and it represents to some extent what you try to do with it, or what you try to achieve through designing and creating it.
Well, there were several things you can say about the process, and basically, CCTV was a kind of building with that seemed inconceivable in terms of realization, particularly in the context of very straightforward and Marxist structural thinking in China. And in order to kind of prove our case with Arab, we had more than kind of 6 important sessions with the kind of 150 most crucial engineers of the whole of China. And basically, they forced us, because they were asking, of course, very good and very important questions, they forced us to an almost obscene knowledge of every member of the kind of building, where it would fail, how it would fail, under what circumstances it would fail. And of course, that could only be kind of handled and answered with the amazing computers that we now have at our disposal. And so in the end, one of the effects of CCTV is that in China you can now do more experimental structural things. And I think that many of the kind of people in this room are actually benefiting from that implant. And I would also say that kind of, for instance, the fact that in China, a country completely dedicated to stability, to have a building that looks different from every angle and that kind of sometimes looks like a window and sometimes like a hammer, is also kind of something that registers kind of whatever the opinion of government is. So I think, yes, you can intervene in a way that modifies maybe slightly kind of values, or that defends certain values.
But it's almost that you're facing a very authoritarian regime, in this case not particularly politically, but in terms of structural engineering knowledge that you have to demonstrate to 50 people rather than maybe a small committee of 2 or 3. A similar thing happened to Foster with the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank. One British engineer said it's going to fall down in a typhoon, and Arabs had to pull out all the stocks who were working with Foster on it to prove that that wouldn't be the case. And you're dealing with 50 rather than one trying to fight that sort of thing.
Yeah, but of course Foster was working in a British colony.
Yes,
It's quite different.
British colonies can be quite authoritarian, it has to be said. But I just wonder that if frustrating and time-consuming though it must have been to deal with this committee of 50 engineers.
No, well, what I'm saying, it was not frustrating. It was beautiful, because it was a form of communication, and it was about an argument, and it was about kind of science and an argument, how science could be kind of conceived and be creatively interpreted. So I'm actually describing a process that I am very being part of, but also that I experienced as a kind of absolutely essential communication between systems, and even on that level.
And then developing knowledge in new ways because of what you have to prove. I wonder if, as we come towards a conclusion, we could say something about you're engaged in a study about the countryside. I know it's incomplete, but many of the issues that you're raising there about the way the countryside has been ignored in any sort of recognition, but the sort of things that have been going on, whether they're agri-industry or certain sorts of exploitative process. Is this looking at what was going on in Singapore, but on a global scale?
No, it's. I think that there is a kind of sometimes a very simple way of looking at our activity, and that is being simply contrarian. And in this case, that is kind of simply what happened. Ever since the statistic that half of mankind is living in cities, it has been kind of an unbelievable cliche that kind of therefore cities are what our future can really kind of represents, and of course I definitely contributed to an enthusiasm about cities, but at some point I simply woke up. And that was because I was in one particular place in the countryside very often and saw it change kind of really drastically. I woke up to the logic that if you look in the city and you look what is around you, most of it is, at least 60 years old, or in many cases 100 years old. But if you look at the countryside, you see changes that are really drastic and kind of really large scale. Really physical and substantial, sociological, anthropological, political, and that therefore the countryside is a much more unstable kind of world than the urban environment. And particularly if you then also combine that and look at it at the rhetoric of the smart city and the kind of pressure on the continuously more kind of wired and sensor-based urban life, and the incredible pressure to also modify architecture through the same technology, then you really begin to see that this neglect of the countryside is kind of really very not very smart and unfair also.
And ultimately,
and particularly if you then also kind of see how the countryside is in a kind of almost permanent state of revolt, whether it is America, in Europe, in not a revolt necessarily in Africa, but still incredible turmoil, and also in Asia, then it's a very big issue.
It's interesting because we think of revolutions as starting in the cities, but what you're describing is that actually it's going to be the instability of the countryside that will force a crisis.
This is the second time I cannot agree with your word crisis. I think the ubiquity of the word crisis, I think, is part of our problem today. We call everything a crisis, and once something is a crisis, we have an alibi not to deal with it. I'm trying, and we are trying, because at this point it's kind of really a fairly large group, is to partly documentary, but it's much more than documentary at this point. But also we're trying to kind of put one-on-one together. We're trying to kind of talk with scientific institutions and basically see not so much what can be done, but first of all what's going on and what the tendencies are, and where you could kind of reverse perhaps certain things.
Yeah. So I understand your criticism of my use of the word crisis, particularly in the way you explain it, that it gives you an excuse not to do anything about it. So what you're doing with the countryside is actually starting to look at what might be done.
Yeah, I think I've never, even in my word or in my writing, used the word crisis, and I would say that has a very simple reason, that I'm